The cry, "Shane, come back." Which 11-year-old boy became the icon of an entire generation of American children? That boy was Brandon Wilde, a rare prodigy who was nominated for a prestigious Oscar. In the public memory, he is an eternal symbol of innocence. Yet this legendary figure could not reclaim his childhood glory as he entered adulthood. Gradually forgotten by the film industry, Brandon drifted into alcoholism and reckless behavior until the life of this golden boy ended with a hard crash under a long-distance rainstorm in Colorado. Why did the film Capital, which once celebrated such an exceptional talent, leave him alone to sink into darkness the moment the spotlight faded? The early 1950s in America was a time of profound contradiction. On the surface, it was an era of booming post-war prosperity, of pristine suburban lawns, gleaming new automobiles, and the aggressive projection of domestic tranquility. But beneath this veneer of stability lurked the deep existential anxieties of the Cold War, the atomic age, and the lingering unspoken traumas of the Second World War. The American public was hungry, desperate even, for narratives that provided moral clarity, for stories where good and evil were easily distinguishable, and where innocence could be protected from the corrupting forces of the world. The Hollywood studio system, operating at the peak of its monolithic power, was the factory uniquely equipped to mass-produce this specific emotional balm. The studios did not just make movies, they engineered psychological experiences designed to comfort, to distract, and to reassure a nervous population. Within this highly industrialized system of emotional production, the child star occupied a uniquely valuable, yet inherently perilous position. Adult actors were commodities, certainly, but they were commodities with agency, with the ability to negotiate, to age, and to transition into different archetypes. The child star, however, was something entirely different. They were the physical embodiment of the nation's idealized vision of itself, pure, uncorrupted, and brimming with potential. When the public looked at a child actor, they were not just looking at a performance. They were looking at a mirror reflecting their own desperate desire for a simpler, safer world. The studios understood this dynamic perfectly. They knew that innocence was not just an abstract concept. It was a highly lucrative currency. And in 1953, Brandon Wilde was the undisputed gold standard of that currency. He was not polished in the traditional plastic sense of the Hollywood machine. He did not have the tap-dancing bravado of a Mickey Rooney or the manufactured ringlet-haired perfection of a Shirley Temple. Brandon's appeal lay in his extraordinary ability to project an inner life, a solemn, watchful intelligence that made him seem simultaneously like a regular boy playing in the dirt and an old soul carrying the weight of the world. This is precisely why his scream at the end of Shane resonated so deeply. It was not just the cry of a boy losing a friend. It was the collective cry of a society watching the mythic, simplistic heroes of the past ride away, leaving them alone in a complex, frightening modern age. The audience projected their own vulnerabilities onto his small, fragile shoulders. They needed him to be exactly who he was in that specific frame of film, perpetually 11 years old, perpetually innocent, perpetually in need of saving. The genesis of the tragedy did not occur on a sun-drenched Hollywood backlot, nor did it begin in a desperate casting call line. Rather, the seeds of Brandon de Wilde's eventual destruction were planted in the humid, claustrophobic backstage corridors of the New York theater world. Brandon was born on the 9th of April, 1942 in Brooklyn, into a family where the lines demarcating reality from performance were already dangerously, fundamentally blurred. His father, Frederick Andre de Wilde, was an established Broadway stage manager, a man whose entire professional existence was dedicated to the meticulous orchestration of artificial realities and the precise management of human emotion for commercial gain. His mother, Eugenia, was a stage actress. For the infant Brandon, there was no clear demarcation between the domestic sphere and the theatrical machinery. He did not have to actively seek out the limelight. He was birthed directly into its harsh, uncompromising glare. While other children of his generation were learning the foundational mechanics of play in suburban backyards, constructing their identities through unstructured imagination and private discovery, Brandon was observing the clinical industrial construction of sentiment. He was a backstage child, absorbing the neuroses, the desperate ambitions, and the highly transactional relationships that define the theatrical ecosystem. From a terrifyingly young age, he learned that human emotion was a tool, a mechanical lever to be pulled on cue to elicit a specific, measurable, and ultimately monetizable response from a paying audience in the dark. This total immersion in the architecture of performance culminated in his professional debut at an age when most children are barely mastering the alphabet. At just 7 years old, Brandon was cast as John Henry West in the Broadway production of Carson McCullers' acclaimed melancholic masterpiece, The Member of the Wedding. This was not a minor background role designed to add a fleeting touch of sentimental color to the stage. It was a demanding, complex, and emotionally taxing part in a dense Southern Gothic drama. He was sharing the stage with formidable, legendary talents like Julie Harris and Ethel Waters, holding his own in a narrative saturated with deep loneliness, racial tension, and existential dread. The critical response to the boy was immediate, overwhelming, and ecstatic. The theater critics of New York, notoriously cynical and difficult to please, were completely disarmed by the raw authenticity of his performance. He became the very first child actor to win the prestigious Donaldson Award, a predecessor to the Tony Awards. But beneath the accolades, the glowing reviews, and the nightly standing ovations, a much darker, insidious process was taking place. A 7-year-old boy was being subjected to the grueling, relentless industrial schedule of a Broadway run. 8 shows a week, matinees on Wednesdays and Saturdays. It required the complete and total surrender of his childhood to the insatiable demands of the box office. The rigid consistency of professional theater, demanding flawless repetition night after night, often conflicts with the natural development of a child's mind. A child's brain is biologically designed for exploration, for novelty, for the spontaneous acquisition of knowledge through unstructured interaction with the world. The professional stage demands the exact punishing opposite. It demands rigid consistency, the flawless repetition of dialogue, blocking and emotion night after night, week after week, month after month. Brandon was not playing. He was working on an assembly line of sentimentality. He was learning day by day that his primary value to the adults around him, his parents, his director, the producers, and the faceless audience, was his ability to reliably manufacture a specific emotional product. He He was rewarded with applause, financial security, and affection only when he successfully executed the rigid parameters of his character. This dynamic creates a profound and dangerous psychological schism in a child. The boy begins to associate love and approval not with his inherent authentic self, but solely with his capacity to perform a convincing illusion. The private, unscripted self becomes secondary, almost irrelevant, to the highly valued, heavily policed public persona. By the time he was 9 years old, Brandon de Wilde was already a seasoned veteran of the emotional factory floor, a miniature, exhausted professional who implicitly understood the brutal economics of audience attention. Hollywood, an industry built upon the ruthless identification and extraction of marketable commodities, inevitably turned its predatory gaze toward the boy wonder of Broadway. In 1952, director Fred Zinnemann helmed the film adaptation of The Member of the Wedding, and Brandon was imported to Los Angeles to reprise his acclaimed role. The transition from the wooden boards of the theater stage to the cold, unforgiving lens of the cinematic camera is a treacherous crossing that has destroyed many adult actors. But Brandon navigated it with an eerie, preternatural ease. The camera, that ultimate lie detector, loved him completely. It magnified his vulnerability, capturing the subtle, fleeting shadows of melancholy that seemed to pool in his large, expressive eyes. He did not overact, which is a common fatal flaw in juvenile performers who are desperate to ensure they are being seen by the audience. He innately understood the power of stillness, the magnetic pull of a child simply observing the baffling, often cruel world of adults. This specific, quiet intensity caught the attention of George Stevens, a titan of American cinema who was in the process of casting a film that he intended to completely redefine the Western genre. George Stevens was not a director who trafficked in simplistic cowboy and Indian cliches or Saturday matinee heroics. Having returned from Europe after serving in the Signal Corps during the Second World War, where he documented the horrific, unimaginable realities of the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp, Stevens had developed a profound, agonizing understanding of human violence. He wanted to make a Western that stripped away the romanticized, bloodless mythology of the American frontier and exposed the brutal, muddy reality of men killing each other over dirt and pride. The film was Shane. The narrative centered on a mysterious, world-weary gunfighter who attempts to settle down with a family of homesteaders, only to be drawn inevitably into a deadly, escalating conflict with a ruthless cattle baron. But Stevens made a crucial, defining artistic choice that would elevate the film to a masterpiece. The entire story, with all its complex moral ambiguities and sudden shocking eruptions of violence, would be filtered through the perspective of a child. That child was Joey Starrett. Stevens needed a boy who could carry the immense thematic weight of the film on his small shoulders. He did not need a child who could twirl a lasso, ride a pony, or deliver precocious comedic punchlines for comic relief. He needed a witness. He needed a child whose face could serve as a blank, highly receptive canvas upon which the audience could project their own deep-seated anxieties about violence, heroism, and the inevitable loss of innocence. He needed Brandon de Wilde. When the massive production moved to the majestic, isolating landscapes of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, Brandon was thrust into a grueling, high-stakes cinematic environment. He was acting opposite Alan Ladd, who played the titular Shane, and Jack Palance, who played the terrifying black-clad hitman Jack Wilson. Alan Ladd was a massive bankable star, but he was also a man plagued by deep crippling insecurities, heavily reliant on alcohol, and deeply self-conscious about his short stature. Palance was a towering, intimidating presence of method-acting menace. Between these damaged, complex, and volatile adult men stood Brandon, an 11-year-old boy tasked with anchoring the emotional reality of a cinematic masterpiece. The process of directing a child in a film of this magnitude, particularly under the demanding eye of a director like Stevens, often involves a degree of psychological manipulation that borders on the unethical. George Stevens was a notorious perfectionist, a relentless director who would shoot dozens, sometimes hundreds, of takes until he achieved the precise, granular emotional resonance he desired for a single frame. For a child, this process is mentally exhausting and deeply disorienting. Stevens understood perfectly that you cannot intellectualize a complex scene for an 11-year-old boy. You must elicit a genuine physical reaction. He would isolate Brandon on set, whisper conflicting instructions to him, deliberately frustrate him, or even frighten him to capture the authentic, unvarnished expressions of awe, terror, and heartbreak that the film demanded. When Joey Starrett watches two men beat each other bloody in the dirt floor of a frontier saloon, the shock on Brandon's face is not entirely acting. It is the raw, visceral reaction of a child being subjected to the simulated brutality of the adult world. The studio was effectively mining the boy's actual nervous system, converting his genuine childhood trepidation into cinematic gold. He was treated as a highly calibrated vessel, emptied of his own childhood experiences, and systematically filled with the meticulously crafted anxieties of a post-war America. When Shane was finally released to the public in the spring of 1953, the cultural impact was nothing short of seismic. It was a massive commercial triumph, a box office juggernaut that resonated deeply with a nation grappling with its own identity and morality in the early, paranoid years of the Cold War. But the true phenomenon of the film, the element that transcended the screen and entered the cultural lexicon, was Brandon Wilde. The audience did not just watch Joey Starrett, they adopted him. They saw in him the purest distillation of the American spirit, hopeful, wide-eyed, yearning for a flawless hero to make a dangerous world safe and just. The relationship between Joey and Shane became a cultural touchstone, a profound meditation on paternal substitution and the dangers of hero worship. Alan Ladd's Shane was the idealized, flawless, unreachable savior, but Brandon's Joey was the human anchor, the vulnerable, beating heart at the center of the violent frontier myth. This dynamic culminated in the film's legendary final sequence, a scene that would permanently brand Brandon Wilde into the collective consciousness of the 20th century. After a bloody, decisive shootout in the dark, smoky confines of the town saloon, Shane, severely wounded, mounts his horse to ride away into the night. He knows, and the film acknowledges, that a man who is killed cannot remain in a peaceful, civilized valley. The stain of violence is indelible, and the frontier is closing. Joey, having followed him through the dark, stands in the dirt of the graveyard, desperate to stop him from leaving. The dialogue in this scene is sparse, but the emotional payload is devastating. Shane tells the boy to go home, to grow up strong and straight, and to tell his mother that there are no more guns in the valley. As Shane rides away, ascending slowly into the dark, shadowy foothills of the Grand Tetons, Joey runs after him. "Shane, Shane, come back!" The boy's voice cracks, echoing off the invisible canyon walls, piercing the silence of the theater. "Pa's got things for you to do, and Mother wants you. I know she does. Shane." It is a cry of absolute, unfiltered desperation. It is the sound of a child realizing for the very first time that heroes are mortal, that violence has a terrible cost, and that the people we love the most can and will abandon us to the dark. The camera lingers on Brandon's face, small and pale in the encroaching darkness, before cutting back to the solitary rider disappearing over the ridge. This scene was not just a masterclass in cinematic staging, it was a profound psychological event for the audience. Brandon de Wilde was not merely acting, he was channeling the collective grief of a society mourning the inevitable loss of its own simplicity. He was the perfect crystalline tear shed for the end of the American frontier, a symbol of innocence forever reaching out for a past that was already gone. The industry's response to this shattering performance was swift, definitive, and seemingly glorious. In early 1954, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences announced the nominations for the 26th Academy Awards. Alongside established veteran titans of the silver screen, the name Brandon de Wilde was listed in the category of Best Actor in a supporting role. At 11 years old, he had reached the absolute zenith of his profession. The image of the young boy dressed in a miniature tuxedo attending the most prestigious, exclusive event in global entertainment was a public relations dream for the studio executives. He was paraded before the flash bulbs, interviewed by fawning reporters, and presented to the world as the ultimate Hollywood fairy tale. The nomination was framed by the press as a celebration of miraculous innate talent, a heartwarming story of a boy wonder conquering the capital of dreams through sheer brilliance. However, viewed through the cold, unforgiving lens of historical retrospect, that Oscar nomination was not a blessing. It was a curse of the highest order. It was the sealing of the tomb. By recognizing him at the very highest level of institutional validation, the Academy was not just praising his past performance, they were permanently, inflexibly defining his future identity. The nomination codified his value entirely within the rigid parameters of a prepubescent boy. It was the ultimate unbreakable seal of approval on the Joey Starrett product line. For the executives operating the financial levers of the Hollywood machinery, Brandon de Wilde was no longer a developing human being with a future. He was a blue-chip stock, an intellectual property that had proven its capacity to generate massive global revenue precisely as he was in that exact moment. This singular moment of supreme triumph forged what can only be described as a terrifying implicit contract between the child, the industry, and the consuming public. This contract was never printed on legal paper. It was never signed with ink, and it was certainly never negotiated by or explained to the child himself. Yet, it was as binding and destructive as any corporate merger. The terms of this silent global agreement were suffocatingly rigid. The studios promised him continued wealth, the finest accommodations, the adulation of millions, and a permanent place in the firmament of the stars. The public promised to buy the movie tickets, to purchase the magazines featuring his face, and to shower him with conditional, overwhelming love. But the core condition of this love was absolute, unyielding, and biologically impossible to fulfill. The contract demanded that Brandon DeWilde remain 11 years old forever. It required him to exist in a state of suspended animation, frozen securely in the amber of that final echoing scene in Shane. The audience did not fall in love with the human boy who would eventually grow body hair, whose voice would drop an octave, who would experience the messy, awkward, and often ugly transition into adulthood. They fell in love with a symbol. They fell in love with a wide-eyed phantom of innocence that existed only within the boundaries of a 35-millimeter frame. They loved the idea of him, the comforting projection of vulnerability that made them feel protective, superior, and secure in their own adult lives. For the studio executives, the calculation was entirely financial and completely devoid of empathy. They had successfully monetized the precise geometry of his childhood face and the specific high-pitched timbre of his pleading voice. Any alteration to that formula was viewed not as natural human growth, but as an unacceptable deviation from the established brand identity. The industry had built a massive, highly profitable superstructure upon the fragile foundation of his boyhood. They had absolutely no contingency plan for the man he was biologically destined to become. In their corporate ledgers, his impending puberty was not a milestone of human development. It was a looming catastrophic depreciation of the asset. The countdown to his obsolescence began the very moment his name was read aloud at the Academy Awards. As Brandon navigated the early years of his fame, bathed in the artificial light of universal approval, a dark, terrifying truth must have begun to crystallize within him. He began to understand, perhaps subconsciously at first, that the applause, the smiles, and the lucrative opportunities were not directed at him, the complex, evolving person beneath the skin. They were directed exclusively at the mask he had been hired to wear. He learned that his value in the world was entirely conditional on his ability to maintain an illusion that his own body was actively conspiring to destroy. Every passing birthday was a breach of contract. Every inch he grew taller was a betrayal of the audience's trust. Every subtle deepening of his voice was a financial liability to the men in the suits. He was a child sitting on a biological time bomb, fully aware that the explosion was inevitable and that it would instantly vaporize his entire world. The golden boy of Hollywood, the Oscar-nominated prodigy who had made a nation weep, was effectively trapped in a luxury prison constructed from his own early success. The walls of this prison were lined with rave reviews and lucrative contracts, but the air inside was rapidly running out. The industry had crowned him a king, but they had given him a kingdom built on shifting sand, fully intending to abandon him the exact moment the tide began to turn. The brilliant, blinding light of his early triumph cast a long, inescapable shadow, a shadow in which the man he would become was already beginning to slowly, quietly suffocate. The entertainment machine had consumed his childhood, digested it into pure profit, and now it was simply waiting for the expiration date to arrive. The transition from childhood to adolescence is, under normal, healthy circumstances, a period of turbulent but entirely necessary metamorphosis. It is a fundamental biological imperative, a time when the human body stubbornly asserts its own autonomous trajectory, shedding the soft, unformed contours of youth to painstakingly construct the architecture of adulthood. For the vast majority of human history, this biological evolution has been celebrated, or at least accepted, as the natural order of existence. But within the strictly controlled, fiercely monetized ecosystem of the mid-20th century Hollywood studio system, this natural human progression was not viewed as a developmental milestone. In the cold, fluorescent-lit boardrooms of Los Angeles, where executives analyzed box office returns and audience demographics, with the clinical detachment of actuaries, the onset of puberty in a highly valuable child star was viewed with profound, unmitigated terror. For Brandon de Wilde, the natural deepening of his voice, the broadening of his shoulders, and the sharpening of his jawline were not celebrated as the emergence of a young man. They were brutally categorized as a manufacturing defect. The product that had been so meticulously marketed, so heavily invested in, and so universally adored by the American public was suddenly, uncontrollably mutating into something entirely unrecognizable. The industry's reaction to this biological inevitability was an extraordinary display of cognitive dissonance and corporate denial. The implicit contract that had been forged upon the release of Shane, the silent agreement that Brandon would remain the eternal innocent 11-year-old Joey Starrett, was suddenly being breached not by conscious rebellion, but by cellular division. The executives looked at the daily rushes of his subsequent films and were horrified to discover that the boy was actively disappearing before their very eyes, replaced by a lanky, awkward teenager. To the system, this was a logistical nightmare of the highest order. They had built a massive, highly profitable superstructure upon the fragile foundation of his boyhood innocence, and they simply possessed no blueprint for what to do with the adolescent reality. The machinery of Hollywood was specifically engineered to exploit the static image, not the evolving human being. They wanted the wide, pleading eyes and the high-pitched voice. They had absolutely no use for the complex, emerging sexuality, the physical awkwardness, or the developing adult intellect of the young man standing before them. He was, in the most ruthless economic terms, rapidly approaching his expiration date, transforming from a pristine, highly sought-after commodity into damaged goods on the shelf. This harsh reality did not manifest as a sudden, dramatic expulsion from the studio gates. The cruelty of Hollywood is rarely so overt. It is instead a slow, agonizing process of attrition. As Brandon navigated his late teens, he desperately attempted to bridge the impossible chasm between his past identity and his present reality. He sought out roles that acknowledged his maturation, desperately trying to prove to the industry and the audience that his talent was not inextricably linked to his childhood prepubescence. In 1959, at the age of 17, he starred in the film Blue Denim, taking on the role of Arthur Bartley, a teenager navigating the perilous, highly controversial waters of an unplanned pregnancy and the agonizing pursuit of an illegal abortion. It was a dark, gritty, and deeply challenging narrative, one that required an emotional maturity far beyond the simplistic morality tales of the early 1950s. Brandon delivered a performance of startling sensitivity and depth, perfectly capturing the suffocating panic and profound vulnerability of a young man caught in a terrible adult dilemma. He proved unequivocally that he possessed the dramatic range and the emotional intelligence to sustain a leading role in a complex, mature, cinematic narrative. However, the response from the American public and the industry power brokers revealed the insurmountable nature of the invisible wall he was crashing against. The audience, collectively suffering from a profound case of nostalgic paralysis, experienced a deep, unsettling cognitive dissonance when watching the film. They did not see Arthur Bartley, the terrified, morally conflicted teenager. They only saw little Joey Starrett from Shane, inexplicably and inappropriately embroiled in a dark, sordid tale of teenage sexuality and back-alley medical procedures. The public felt actively betrayed by his maturation. They felt that he had broken the unspoken promise to remain their eternal symbol of innocence. By daring to inhabit a narrative that acknowledged the messy, complicated realities of adult life, Brandon had violated the sacred, sanitized image that the audience had so desperately projected onto him. The film, despite its inherent qualities and his powerful performance, served only to alienate the very demographic that had once elevated him to superstardom. He was trapped in a terrifying paradox. If he continued to play children, he looked ridiculous. But when he attempted to play young adults, the audience recoiled in horror, utterly unwilling to accept the destruction of the illusion they had purchased. This suffocating dynamic reached its tragic, ironic zenith in 1963, when Brandon was cast in Martin Ritt's masterful, cynical, and deeply influential film, HUD. At 21 years old, Brandon was tasked with playing Lonnie Bannon, the earnest, morally upright nephew of the film's titular character, a ruthless, charming, and deeply amoral Texas rancher played with devastating charisma by Paul Newman. The film is a brilliant, unsparing dissection of the American West, a brutal deconstruction of the very frontier mythology that Shane had so perfectly summarized a decade earlier. Within the narrative architecture of HUD, Brandon's character serves as the crucial moral compass, the innocent observer caught in the agonizing crossfire between his fiercely principled traditional grandfather, played by Melvin Douglas, and his deeply corrupt, purely selfish uncle. Brandon's performance was nothing short of a revelation. He held his own against two of the most formidable actors in the history of American cinema, anchoring the film's complex ethical debates with a quiet, devastating sincerity. He was the soulful, grieving heart of the picture, watching helplessly as the moral fabric of his family, and by extension his country, was ruthlessly shredded. Yet despite the brilliance of his work, the cultural reception of HUD inadvertently finalized his systematic erasure from the Hollywood hierarchy. The film was released at the very beginning of a massive seismic cultural shift in American society. The early 1960s were the dawn of an era defined by countercultural rebellion, deep political cynicism, and a profound rejection of traditional Eisenhower-era values. The audience did not leave the theater admiring the earnest moral purity of Lonnie Bannon. They left utterly captivated by the dangerous, unapologetic nihilism of Paul Newman's HUD. Newman's anti-hero became the defining cultural icon of the moment, a blueprint for the rebellious anti-establishment protagonists who would dominate the cinema of the late 1960s and 1970s. In this rapidly shifting cultural landscape, Brandon DeWilde was an agonizing anachronism. He represented the earnest, unironic, and deeply moralistic past that the new generation of filmgoers was actively, aggressively rejecting. He had delivered the performance of a lifetime, a masterclass in subtle reactive acting, but he was playing a hero in an era that had suddenly irrevocably decided to worship the villain. The cultural zeitgeist had moved on, and it had left him standing in the dust of a Texas ranch, holding a moral compass that no one else wanted to look at. The aftermath of HUD marked the true beginning of his descent into the purgatory of obscurity. Despite appearing in a critically acclaimed, culturally significant masterpiece, the industry did not reward him with the trajectory of a leading man. Instead, the phone calls began to taper off with a terrifying, agonizing slowness. The scripts that were once delivered directly to his front door by breathless studio couriers were suddenly replaced by polite, evasive rejections from casting directors. He was not experiencing the typical temporary lull in a fluctuating career. He was experiencing a highly coordinated systemic expulsion. The studios had collectively, wordlessly agreed that Brandon de Wilde was a relic, a beautiful antique that possessed historical significance, but absolutely no modern commercial utility. When directors of the emerging New Hollywood movement, men like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, and Arthur Penn, were casting their gritty, realistic, and profoundly cynical films, they did not look for the boy who had wept at the end of Shane. They looked for raw, method-trained, unpredictable actors who carried no baggage from the golden age of the studio system. Brandon was entirely too famous to be a fresh discovery, yet utterly unmarketable as a contemporary leading man. He was stranded in a barren, desolate no-man's land between his own monumental past and a future that simply refused to accommodate him. The psychological torture of this gradual erasure is almost impossible to overstate. For a man who had been told from the age of 7 that his entire existential worth was inextricably linked to the validation of a camera lens and the applause of an audience, the sudden deafening silence of the industry was a fate far worse than a sudden scandalous firing. If he had been involved in a massive public scandal, he could have at least understood the mechanics of his rejection. He could have fought against a tangible narrative. But there was no scandal. There was no catastrophic failure of talent. There was only a cold, silent, and impenetrable wall of indifference. He would attend industry parties, standing on the periphery of the room, watching the new generation of stars being courted and flattered by the same executives who had once treated him like royalty. He would endure the unbearable humiliation of the fake sympathetic smiles, the hollow promises of, "We must find something for you," and the agonizing realization that the people who had built his pedestal had long since walked away, leaving him to balance on it entirely alone. He was forced to navigate the deeply humiliating, soul-crushing circuit of television guest appearances, a professional graveyard for faded film stars. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, he appeared on programs like The Virginian, Wagon Train, and Hawaii Five-0. In the promotional materials, he was often billed with the tragic, patronizing prefix of special guest star. But this billing was not an honor. It was a morbid marketing tactic, a way for television producers to exploit the fading, nostalgic glow of his childhood fame to boost their weekly ratings. He was paraded out onto the small screen not as a vital contemporary artist, but as a living museum exhibit, a walking, talking piece of trivia for the audience to point at and say, "Whatever happened to that boy from Shane?" He was required to hit his marks, deliver dialogue that was often beneath his considerable capabilities, and pretend that he was grateful for the opportunity to work, all while silently carrying the crushing, unbearable weight of knowing that he was participating in the public degradation of his own legacy. As the scripts dwindled and the periods of agonizing, empty time between jobs stretched from weeks into months and then into years, the vast echoing void of his existence became physically unbearable. When a human being is stripped of their primary identity, when the singular purpose that has defined their entire conscious life is suddenly, irrevocably revoked, the mind desperately seeks a mechanism to survive the crushing weight of the resulting uselessness. For Brandon de Wilde, forced into early involuntary retirement by an industry that had vampirically drained his youth, the only available refuge was not found in therapy, nor in a career reinvention, but at the bottom of a glass. Alcoholism, in the context of the discarded child star, is rarely a disease born of a desire to party or a reckless pursuit of hedonism. It is fundamentally a desperate, functional application of a chemical anesthetic. He did not drink to feel alive. He drank to numb the excruciating, relentless pain of being a phantom, a man who was technically breathing, but who had been socially and professionally dead for a decade. The drink offered him a temporary chemical time machine, a way to blur the sharp, jagged edges of a reality where the phone never rang and the mailbox was always empty. In the hazy, disconnected warmth of intoxication, he could temporarily silence the mocking, internal voice that constantly reminded him of everything he had lost. He could blur out the faces of the casting directors who looked at him with pity, and he could drown the memory of the 11-year-old boy who had inadvertently destroyed his life by being entirely too perfect on screen. Alcohol became his most loyal companion, the only entity in his life that did not judge him for growing older, that did not demand that he remain frozen in 1953, and that reliably delivered the oblivion he so desperately craved. But this sanctuary was entirely illusory, a treacherous, collapsing structure that only accelerated his physical and spiritual decay. The more he drank to escape the reality of his obsolescence, the more unemployable he became, creating a horrific, self-perpetuating cycle of rejection, despair, and chemical self-medication. He was trapped in the agonizing, suffocating labyrinth of his own history, a man who had reached the absolute summit of human adulation before he had even learned how to navigate the basic complexities of the world. He was living out the long, slow, agonizing denouement of a story that the public had stopped reading 20 years earlier. The tragedy of Brandon de Wilde during these phantom years was not marked by dramatic outbursts or public spectacles of self-destruction. It was a quiet, domestic tragedy, played out in the shadows of an industry town that specifically designs itself to ignore the casualties it leaves behind. He was a ghost haunting the periphery of a machine that never stops moving, a casualty of a ruthless, industrialized system of emotional extraction that views the human soul as nothing more than a temporary, highly disposable battery. The Hollywood machine had successfully manufactured his rise, heavily profited from his peak, and methodically engineered his obsolescence, leaving him completely alone in the dark, armed with nothing but a bottle and the fading, echoing memory of a scream that could never, ever call back the past. The agonizing, protracted twilight of Brandon de Wilde's career coincided with one of the most violent, seismic cultural upheavals in modern American history, creating a juxtaposition so brutal it bordered on the grotesque. As the late 1960s violently tore down the sanitized picket fence mythology of the Eisenhower era, Brandon found himself stranded on the wrong side of the generational divide, a living, breathing artifact of a discarded civilization. The cinematic landscape was undergoing a ruthless, bloody revolution. The studios, hemorrhaging money and completely out of touch with a radicalized youth culture, were surrendering power to the bearded, cynical auteurs of the new Hollywood movement. Films like Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, and Easy Rider were rewriting the fundamental grammar of American cinema, replacing the upright, moralistic heroes of the past with alienated drifters, neurotic anti-heroes, and unapologetic outlaws. In this chaotic, violently shifting ecosystem, where rebellion was the only marketable currency and anti-establishment sentiment was the new baseline for authenticity, Brandon was an excruciating anomaly. With his polite demeanor, his neatly combed hair, and his inextricable permanent association with the most earnest mythic Western ever committed to celluloid, he was the precise embodiment of the establishment that the new generation of filmmakers was actively seeking to destroy. He was not just out of fashion, he was ideologically obsolete. The very qualities that had made him a global phenomenon in 1953, his unquestioning earnestness, his moral purity, his projection of a safe, uncomplicated American innocence, were now the exact attributes that rendered him utterly unemployable. He was a relic of a bygone era, walking through a Hollywood that had completely, entirely changed its religion overnight, leaving him kneeling at an altar that had been unceremoniously demolished. To navigate this hostile, rapidly evolving terrain, Brandon attempted to violently shed the suffocating skin of his past, seeking refuge and reinvention in the burgeoning, chaotic counterculture of the late 1960s music scene. He gravitated towards the fringes of the country rock movement, forming in Los Angeles, desperately trying to absorb the careless bohemian authenticity of musicians who were actively rejecting the rigid corporate structures of the entertainment industry. He became a fixture in the orbit of Graham Parsons, the brilliant, self-destructive pioneer of cosmic American music, and even befriended the members of the Byrds. But this association was deeply, fundamentally tragic in its execution. Brandon was not a musician. He was a spectator desperately trying to purchase a ticket to a revolution he did not naturally belong to. He hung around the recording studios and the smoke-filled clubs not as a creative peer, but as a famous mascot, a curiosity from a previous era, attempting to wear the clothes of the new vanguard. The musicians tolerated him, perhaps even liked him, but they did not view him as one of their own. They were creating the soundtrack for a new America, while Brandon was a ghost haunting the periphery, desperately hoping that some of their effortless, rebellious cool would miraculously rub off on him. But authenticity cannot be borrowed, and the more he tried to integrate himself into the counterculture, the more glaringly obvious his displacement became. He was a classically trained, highly disciplined studio product, trying to convincingly play the role of a reckless rock and roll drifter, and the performance convinced absolutely no one, least of all himself. This profound professional and cultural dislocation inevitably bled into the intimate architecture of his personal life, poisoning his attempts to build a stable, functional domestic reality. The psychological wreckage of a childhood spent entirely in the artificial, transactional environment of the Hollywood studio system does not magically repair itself when the cameras are turned off. It simply mutates, infecting every interpersonal relationship with the toxic dynamics of performance and conditional love. In 1963, at the incredibly young age of 21, Brandon married Susan M. Maw. To the outside observer, it might have appeared as a desperate, accelerated grasp at normalcy, a conscious attempt to construct the traditional, grounded family unit that his own nomadic theatrical childhood had fiercely denied him. But a marriage cannot function as a psychological rehabilitation center, and a spouse cannot be expected to retroactively parent a husband who was robbed of his fundamental developmental milestones. Brandon was a man who had been taught from the age of 7 that his primary value lay in his ability to please an audience, to hit his marks, and to project an illusion of emotional stability. He brought these deeply ingrained, highly dysfunctional survival mechanisms directly into his marriage. When the inevitable conflicts and complex emotional demands of a genuine, unscripted adult relationship arose, Brandon possessed no authentic emotional vocabulary with which to respond. He knew how to play the role of a husband, but he lacked the fundamental, terrifying vulnerability required to actually be one. The birth of their son Jesse, rather than serving as an anchoring force, only amplified the quiet, desperate tragedy of Brandon's internal life. To look at one's own child is to look at a terrifying mirror of one's own past. And for Brandon, that past was a heavily documented, publicly consumed product. How does a man who was systematically commodified and exploited by his own parents, who was robbed of the sacred private right to a normal childhood, navigate the profound, terrifying responsibilities of fatherhood? The pressure to protect his son from the very machinery that had consumed him must have been paralyzing, generating a deep, unspoken anxiety that permeated the household. He was acutely aware of the fragility of childhood innocence because he had personally experienced its violent commercial extraction. This hyper-awareness, combined with his escalating career anxieties and his increasing reliance on alcohol to numb the pain of his professional erasure, created a toxic, suffocating domestic environment. The marriage, built on a foundation of unresolved trauma and desperate projection, slowly and agonizingly collapsed under the weight of his unfulfilled potential. They divorced in 1969, leaving Brandon adrift once again, a man who had failed to secure the professional validation he craved, and who had now failed to construct the domestic sanctuary he so desperately needed. He had played the heroic, dependable son on screen for millions, but he could not sustain the role of a dependable partner in the quiet, unlit reality of his own home. Stripped of his cinematic career, alienated from the cultural zeitgeist, and standing in the wreckage of his first marriage, Brandon retreated to the only familiar territory remaining to him, the theater. But this was not a triumphant, celebrated return to the glittering, prestigious Broadway stages of his youth, where he had once been hailed as a prodigious genius. This was a desperate, humiliating descent into the grueling, unforgiving circuit of regional theater and summer stock productions. He traveled across the country performing in plays like Butterflies Are Free and The Owl and The Pussycat in secondary markets, playing to audiences in places like Chicago, Ohio, and Florida. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like the honorable, resilient work of a dedicated craftsman refusing to give up on his art. But the psychological reality of the regional theater circuit for a former global superstar is akin to a slow, public execution of the ego. He was not hired for these regional productions because of his brilliant, nuanced interpretation of the text. He was hired strictly as a morbid marketing gimmick. The local theater promoters splashed his name across the marquees, not to promise a night of transcendent dramatic art, but to exploit the fading, nostalgic curiosity of middle American audiences. The people who bought tickets to see Brandon Wilde in a dimly lit dinner theater in the Midwest did not come to engage with the complex emotional themes of the play. They came to stare at a piece of living memorabilia. They sat in the dark, cutting into their steaks, waiting for the 30-year-old man on stage to inadvertently reveal a glimpse of the 11-year-old boy they remembered from Shane. The applause he received was not a validation of his present performance, but a patronizing, pitying acknowledgement of his past glory. He was required to stand on stage night after night, offering up fragments of his battered, exhausted soul to audiences who were entirely uninterested in his evolution, fully aware that he was participating in a grotesque nightly pantomime of his own professional funeral. It was an exercise in absolute unmitigated humiliation, a constant, abrasive reminder of exactly how far he had fallen from the dizzying cinematic heights of his childhood. In a desperate final attempt to exert some semblance of control over a life that felt increasingly like a terrifying, unpiloted freefall, Brandon purchased a camper van. On the surface, it was a practical vehicle for a man required to travel constantly for regional theater work. But symbolically, the van was a profound, deeply revealing manifestation of his psychological state. A camper van is the ultimate vehicle of the nomad, a mobile, self-contained sanctuary for a man who feels he has no permanent place in the world. It is a physical declaration of rootlessness. By choosing to live and travel in this metal box, Brandon was effectively seceding from the conventional structures of a society that had already rejected him. He was embracing the identity of the drifter, physically abandoning the unforgiving, judgmental geography of Los Angeles, the city that had built him, exploited him, and discarded him to lose himself in the vast, anonymous expanse of the American highway system. The tragic irony of this choice is almost too painful to articulate. The American West, the sprawling, mythic landscape of mountains and plains, was the exact geographical setting of his permanent imprisonment. It was the backdrop of Shane, the very environment that had permanently frozen his image in the public consciousness. He was now driving a van through the actual physical locations of his cinematic mythology, a ghost haunting the scenery of his own greatest triumph, desperately searching for a sense of freedom in the exact place where his identity had been permanently chained to a celluloid frame. The van offered him the illusion of forward momentum, the comforting, hypnotic hum of the tires on the asphalt suggesting progress. But in reality, he was not driving towards a destination. He was simply fleeing a past that was inextricably attached to him. He was a man trapped in a mobile cage, staring out through the windshield at a country that loved a fictional version of him, completely oblivious to the agonizing slow-motion destruction of the real human being gripping the steering wheel. As the calendar turned to 1972, Brandon was rapidly approaching a psychological precipice that is terrifying for any actor, but absolutely lethal for a discarded child star, his 30th birthday. In the cruel, age-obsessed mathematics of the entertainment industry, turning 30 is a definitive, uncompromising milestone. It is the absolute final demarcation line between youth and maturity. For Brandon, who had spent his entire conscious life defined by his precocity, by his status as a boy wonder, the approach of his 30th birthday was not a cause for celebration. It was the ringing of a death knell. It was the final, undeniable biological confirmation that the boy from Shane was completely, irrevocably dead. He could no longer rely on the lingering, fading residue of his youthful charm to secure even the most demeaning television guest spots. He was officially a middle-aged actor with a bankrupt resume, carrying the suffocating, inescapable baggage of a child star legacy. This impending milestone undoubtedly generated a profound, suffocating psychological pressure, a desperate, frantic need to prove that his life was not entirely over, that he could still salvage some remnant of the brilliant future he had been promised 20 years earlier. He had recently married again to a woman named Janice Ginge in yet another rapid, desperate attempt to construct a stabilizing domestic anchor amidst the terrifying turbulence of his professional collapse. But a new marriage could not fix an old, rotting foundation. The internal machinery was breaking down, corroded by years of rejection, heavily lubricated by alcohol, and vibrating violently under the immense, crushing weight of unfulfilled expectations. He was a man holding his breath, waiting for a catastrophic impact that he knew, deep in his bones, was absolutely inevitable. The storm was no longer just a metaphorical concept describing his career. It was a physical reality gathering in the dark, heavy clouds above the Rocky Mountains, preparing to wash him away completely. The heavy van hydroplaned on the slick asphalt, striking a parked flatbed truck. The impact was immediate and devastating. Paramedics rushed the severely injured 30-year-old to St. Anthony Hospital in Denver. Despite the urgent efforts of trauma surgeons, the blunt force injuries were too severe. At 7:20 p.m. on July 6, 1972, Brandon Wilde passed away. The morning after his death, the press swiftly reduced his complex tragedy to a simple traffic accident. Obituaries remembered Shane's little boy, completely ignoring the decade of industrial neglect that preceded his fatal drive. Studio executives offered hollow condolences for a man they had long since deemed unprofitable. The public mourned Joey Starrett, the immortal celluloid phantom, unaware of the exhausted 30-year-old man who perished in the storm. His final devastating cry in the shadow of the Grand Tetons proved agonizingly prophetic. "Shane, come back," was no longer just a line in a script. It was the desperate plea of a talent abandoned to the darkness, left entirely alone by an industry that had already ridden away